Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh, Perek Yudches and Yutes. This class is dedicated to Nishmas Elchanan Meir ben Mordechai and Miriam Bas Daniel. In Perek Yudches, the Rambam makes a number of technical points relating to the Iyas Halavana, the moon sighting. Firstly, a very important one. Just because there's a possibility of visibility, that doesn't guarantee the actual visibility. Even if your calculations told you that in Eretz Yisrael, from Yerushalayim, it will be possible to sight the moon on the night following the Moiled, that doesn't mean witnesses will actually see it. First of all, weather conditions have to be optimal. Obviously, on a cloudy night, no one's going to see the moon. And secondly, the location of the witnesses matters very much. If they're on a high mountain, they have a much better chance of seeing the moon. If they're low in a valley, well, their chances are smaller, especially if the moon is going to be small to begin with. A great benchmark for this, says the Rambam, is to consider the relationship between the Oirech Rishon and the Keshes Hariyah. We remember in the end of Perek Yud Zayin, once you reached the final Keshes, the final arc, the final distance in longitude between the sun and the moon, you had to compare it to the Oirech Rishon, which was the original distance and longitude that came out in your calculations between the sun and the moon. If together the number of their degrees reached a minimum of 22, that meant the moon would be possible to be sighted. But that's just a minimum. Obviously, there could be a maximum, where together the Keshes Hariyah and the Oirech Rishon will equal a much larger amount of degrees. So the Rambam says here, consider the relationship between the Keshes Hariyah and the Oirech Rishon. If they're just barely making it past 22, then the moon is going to be very small. And you have to make sure you're in a great place, optimal viewing and optimal weather. If the Keshes Hariyah and the Oirech Rishon have reached their maximum amount of degrees, well then you have an easier chance. The moon's crescent is going to be bigger, and you can settle for less optimal conditions. Talking about weather conditions, the Rambam moves on to a major point that has to be considered. If month after month, on the night when the moon could be sighted, the skies are cloudy, causing a lack of visibility, this could lead to a ridiculous calendar result. Beis Din can't declare Rosh Chodesh on the day following the Moiled unless witnesses came. If witnesses didn't come, the next day would be declared Rosh Chodesh, day number 30. So imagine if for a couple of months in a row, it was cloudy outside on that exact night, such that for a number of months in a row, Rosh Chodesh was declared on the 30th day. This would lead to consecutive months, each having 30 days, and since the Moiled only happens every 29 and a half days, ultimately the Moiled will begin getting earlier and earlier, to the point that after 6 or 7 months, the Moiled would now be finding itself on day 25 or 26 of the month. As the Rambam says, Ein lecha dvar schek vehefsid gadol mizeh. There's nothing more laughable than that. The whole idea of Beis Din being Mekadesh al pi hariyah was to set in place a proper, good, functioning calendar. But if this is going to lead to having a Moiled way too early, certainly that's not a tenable option. So of course the Rambam explains, together with the mechanism of being Mekadesh the Chodesh based on the Iyas HaEdim, there certainly had to also be a Kabbalah, a tradition that Beis Din had. And part of this tradition governed the amount of 30-day months there could be in a year. It also governed how many 29-day months there could be in a year. The Rambam gives the ratio of 8 to 4. You never have more than 8 of one type, and you can never have less than 4 of the other type. In this way, we make sure the calendar itself stays organized and never leads Rosh Chodesh or the Moiled to be in a ridiculous time. The final point that Rambam makes in this Perek is based on that which is explained in the Sifrei Cheshbon HaTkufos VaGematriyos, the Sfarim that calculate the Tkufos and geometry. And that is that all the calculations in these prakim, in these halachas, are correct for Yerushalayim. Now, the more west you travel from Yerushalayim, the later Shkia will get relative to Yerushalayim. The more east you travel from Yerushalayim, the earlier Shkia will get. So mathematically speaking, if your computations tell you that the moon will be visible in Yerushalayim after sunset on the night following the Moiled, meaning that the moon at that time has gotten far enough from the sun to be seen above the horizon, then it'll certainly be visible in the more western locations where Shkia is later, meaning the moon has even more time to get further away from the sun. However, if the moon is not going to be visible in Eretz Yisrael, that doesn't mean that it won't be visible in the western locations, because perhaps by the time Shkia comes around over there, the moon will have had enough time to distance itself from the sun and be seen there. Therefore, the inverse is also true. If you know that the moon is sighted in the western locations to Yerushalayim, that doesn't mean necessarily that it will be sighted in Yerushalayim. On the other hand, though, if it's not sighted in the western locations, that means if by the time Shkia came around over there, the moon didn't get far enough from the sun, well then certainly it will not be visible in Eretz Yisrael. All of the same holds true, somewhat in an opposite way, when it comes to Yerushalayim in relationship to the eastern locations. If the moon is not visible in Eretz Yisrael, it'll certainly not be visible in the eastern locations. If the moon is visible in Eretz Yisrael, that still doesn't tell you anything about the eastern locations. It could still be that it won't be visible in the east, because when Shkia happens there, the moon hasn't gotten far enough from the sun. Only when it gets to Eretz Yisrael, it gets far enough from the sun. On the other hand, if the moon is visible in the eastern locations, it'll certainly be visible in Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam concludes this Perek with a huge caveat, and that is that this entire foregoing conversation about the western locations and the eastern locations are only talking about those locations that are on the same latitude as Yerushalayim. Once you go out of the latitude of Yerushalayim, higher above the equator, or further lower relative to the equator, now you're dealing with a whole new parsha, the whole new timetable. Everything changes when it comes to the Shkia times, and nothing can be learned from the moon's visibility in Yerushalayim. In Perek Yotes, the final Perek of these halachos, the Rambam tells us the following. Chazal and the Gemara give us the list of questions that Beis Din used to ask the witnesses who came to testify that they saw the moon. Among those questions were the following two. Leheichon haya hayareach noita, to where was the crescent of the moon facing, to which direction was it pointing? And kama haya gavaya, how tall did the moon appear in the sky? Now, these two questions aren't directly relevant to the actual sighting of the moon. Nevertheless, since it's mentioned by the Chachamim, the Rambam says, Kasher be'enai, it's fitting in my eyes to let you know how to calculate this, even though I'm not going to be precise about it, says the Rambam, because again, it's not relevant to the sighting. So how do we ascertain which direction the crescent of the moon will be pointing? So we begin with the concept that we've already visited a number of times, and that is that the Galgal HaMazoles, the path against which the sun and the moon make their orbit around the earth, is inclined 23.5 degrees relative to the equator. What that means is that besides for 0 and 180 degrees, where it's exactly a meeting point, any star in any mazel along the entire Galgal HaMazoles is inclined relative to the equator anywhere between 0 and 23.5 degrees. In Perek Tes Zayin we learned that besides for the Galgal HaMazoles being inclined to the equator, the moon's orbit is further inclined another 5 degrees, which means there's a maximum inclination of 28.5 degrees. The thing about the moon's orbit, though, was that it's not stationary. It's not like in the north side it's always higher, more northerly, and in the south side it's always more southerly. Instead, the moon's orbit itself is rotating along the Galgal HaMazoles, so that at any point in the Galgal HaMazoles, either northerly or southerly, the moon could be inclined either to the north or to the south, which means either up to 5 degrees more or up to 5 degrees less. So the first thing you need to do, if you want to figure out to which direction the crescent of the moon will be pointing on the night of the Re'iyah, the night of the sighting, is you have to first figure out how much is the moon inclined relative to the equator. So first, you look at which mazel the moon is in, and you figure out the inclination of that mazel to the equator. Then you figure out the roichav hayareach, the moon's latitudinal difference relative to the Galgal HaMazoles, figure out whether that's northerly or southerly, and depending on the original inclination of the mazel, you either add the roichav hayareach or you subtract the roichav hayareach from the original inclination. This has all been explained again in earlier prakim. Once you reach the inclination of the moon, says the Rambam, check the following. So long as the moon is within 3 degrees of the equator, you will observe it in the sky after Shkia in due west. That means straight ahead in the west, and its crescent will be pointing directly upwards towards the east. However, if the moon is inclined more than 3 degrees north of the equator, then the moon will be seen in the sky more northerly. In other words, not due west, but more to the northwest, and its crescent will be pointing north. Same thing if the moon is inclined more than 3 degrees south of the equator, then the moon will be observed in the southwest in the sky, and its crescent will be pointing to the south. The reason for this is as follows. The part of the moon that we see is there because the sun, which has just set, is lighting it up. Now, the moon is so close to the sun that the sun is not lighting up any more than the moon that we can see. It's lighting up the half that we can see that's closer to the sun and just giving us a little crescent that we can observe in the sky. So whatever direction the moon is relative to the sun is the direction that the moon's crescent will be pointing. If it's directly in line with the equator, at least within 3 degrees, that means it's pretty much in line with the sun, and the crescent will be facing to the east. In other words, the bottom of the crescent will be the western side, lit up by the sun, and the 2 horns will be pointing to the east. If it's inclined to the north, then that means it's northerly relative to the sun, so the sun is lighting up more of its southerly part, and the horns will be pointing to the north. If it's in a southerly inclination, then that means that it's southerly relative to the sun is lighting up the bottom of the crescent more to the northerly side, and its crescent points will be facing to the south. As far as the question of how high the moon appears in the sky, well, that can be determined based on the keshes hariyah, the final longitudinal difference between the sun and the moon. If the keshes hariyah is big, that means that the distance between the sun and the moon is big. So after sunset, the moon is still higher in the sky. It will take longer to set below the horizon. So when the moon will be seen by the witnesses, it will be seen at a higher point. If the keshes hariyah is small, the distance between the moon and the sun is small, so right after the sun sets, the moon will appear lower in the sky, giving you only a small window of time to observe it and be mekadesh the chodesh based on that. And we conclude with the final halacha in Perek Yutes. The Rambam says, Harei be'arnu. We've explained to you all the calculations and all the math that's necessary so that no path of the Torah should be lacking and that nobody should need to wander onto other svarim and to search from there. As the pasuk says, Dirshu mi'al sefer Hashem ukro, you can inquire everything from upon the sefer of the Eibishter and you can read it there. Achas mehena loy ne'adara, one of them, not one of them, is lacking.